Half a decade of Unreality. This is a collection of reports that occurred over the space of 5 years, and it was sent in by a subscriber called Etazhi. Thanks for sending it in, mate, and without further ado, we'll get stuck in. So where do I begin? This took place over half a decade, so I guess I'll start with where it all began. The first peek down the rabbit hole that was ketamine. It began one day when I was turning 16. I was in the middle of a 4-tab deep trip. I remember the call vividly. How could anyone forget the first time they get a hold of their favourite drug? I remember it like I had only just woken up out of that K-hole only now. Hey, do you want K? My buddy has some. I instantly jumped on the offer. The previous moment of having been pondering as to just how this pole in front of me could have possibly been bent like a Dr. Seuss tree trunk had completely left my mind. You see, I was a Dex fiend. Dextromethorphan, as in cough syrups, and the brand I fancied was a Canadian one called Benylin. That is if Robogels weren't around. Entranced by the dissociative world since I was 15, I would pore over era with trip reports about the K-hole and other drug porn. Unable to get the stuff for so long, it seemed unreal that this was happening, right now on my birthday. I stand up to leave. The girl who tried to kiss me earlier sat on the ground and looked up at me as I stood. She was waiting for me to get off the phone to continue our conversation about... Okay, to be honest, I forgot about what. I was tripping okay. It was really only inevitable at this point. The thought of all the drug porn, the sweet bosom of the K-hole, was flooding my mind. This woman's real bosom staring at me in the face was not of my concern right now. There were drugs to be had halfway across the city. We arranged every drunk person's way home, and after awkward exchanges and grueling waits for the taxi drivers, me and a ragtag band of 2 other friends, J and H, headed towards our dealer's house. I arrive and the yard is still full of the evidence of a cookout. Food and styrofoam plates litter the grass. I was here earlier when I bought this acid, and my dealer gave me a loaded plate of so many barbecue meats and foods I nearly puked eating it all. I can hear their chatter as I head inside. Tripping intensely, I walk down the hallway. I enter to a room full of people staring at me. My dealer sat at the table with his friend doing lines of K. I was slightly unnerved, and obviously tripping hard. Suddenly, my dealer announces to the room, "Hey, this is the kid who took 4 tabs, you fucking crazy man." The group laughs and some murmurs of a sort of, okay, this guy isn't new to this, an acceptance I wasn't just a naive high schooler. "How much do you want?" "A gram." "How much is a gram?" "I don't sell grams, I move it by the ounces." "I pay $100, which isn't true, but his eyes lit up at that mention, so we were both mutually benefiting from this price tag. I gave him my $100. He didn't even weigh it, he just eyeballed it and gave it to me in a yellow folded up notebook paper. His friend ended up giving me a good 2 grams for the price of $100. Excited, I left outside to meet my friends. "Let me see," asks H. I unfold the notebook paper and show him a pile of tiny rectangular, long needle-shaped crystals. The white contrasts deeply against the yellow notebook paper with red lines. The needles looked exactly like the needler ammunition from the Halo series. We head off to the high school, me still tripping intensely, and the other 2 having begun to sober up from their excessive drinking at my birthday fiesta. I'm headed home actually. H makes a sudden and impulsive decision. "Nah, come on man, I got some K. It's my birthday, let's go get fucked up," I pleaded to him. He denies and heads back towards the bus station. Sort of disappointed, Jay and I continue on. Not even half a block away, my friend is heard running back, the soles of his shoes pattering against the pavement. "Wait, yo." A catches up to us. "Yo, I'll come chill with y'all. I changed my mind." Cheered up and reinvigorated by his retraction of his decision, we walked. All I remember from this walk was how yellow everything seemed. Everything always was along most streets. This gives me a nostalgic vibe for some reason. Not much else of note happens until we get to the school. J, H and myself arrive at the main building, and we head to a little courtyard. We hide by some of the doors to the gymnasium out of sight of most people, except from one specific angle or entryway. I unfold the paper. Staring back at us is the pile of needle shards. We had no idea what to do, so we just sniffed it right from the pile without crushing it with a green 20 bill H had. All I will remember for this next while is that I completely fell in love once I experienced this one specific effect. The little enclave we had found ourselves in, a space no more than 1.5 feet long by 4 feet wide and 7.5 feet tall, had expanded. It had become a massive, incomprehensibly big room. Me and H found ourselves in the centre. J had fell asleep, and we mostly ignored him. This room we found ourselves in was simply too massive. It was the size of a football field on all 3 axes. It was disorientating as it was fascinating. The acid had definitely potentiated the ketamine. The only thing I can recall from this was being in that room before we somehow ended up at the basketball courts beside the parking lot, and I got freaked out by a bunch of people by the stairs. They seemed like they were watching us. I could only barely make out heads turning towards me in my blurry vision. Ever since that day I was entranced. The ketamine molecule had gotten its hands around my neurons. The next experience I had was on New Year's Eve, when I had turned 17. It was probably the most insane, prolific and profound experience of my life to this very day. I'd dropped a significant amount of acid in my typical style, a 5-strip I believe, and brought over to my cousins a gram of some of the best needle shard I've ever had. I was watching a show on my block, which had recently been shown to me at the time. I was enjoying watching the show on acid. I had many laughs with my cousins as we binged the series. Soon though, however, I was going to encounter an entire rabbit hole that I was not entirely prepared for. "Do you want a dab?" my cousin said. The beaker bong with a quartz nail attachment was in his hand, the green propane torch in his other, and a parchment paper with golden brittle shatter sat upon it and was laid out in front of us on the desk. I contemplated it for a moment. A heavy stoner, I knew very well what I was signing up for. A single joint of cannabis was going to send my trip sky high right now. The psychedelics reset your tolerance temporarily, as well as synergize intensely with it. But a dab? My god. Who would do such a thing to themselves? Who in the right mind would accept some of the most potent forms of tetrahydrocannabinol in the middle of the most intense acid trip they had ever been in? Well, I would of course. You see, I knew that cannabis and psychedelics were a ticket to a trip beyond what would have ever been possible without the cannabis. However, I perhaps did not fully grasp just how powerful a single dab could be under the influence of this drug. Another notable thing to mention about psychedelics is that often I found that they would suppress my cough reflex almost entirely sometimes. This time, it manifested intensely. This will be relevant in a second. My cousin loads what he calls a snake or a gummy worm, a thick, long, globular piece of the THC resin. A very strong dose of cannabis without the acid for anyone. He sets it on the table so that it's ready for me to grab. He sparks the green propane torch and a beautiful blue jet flame shoots out and roars. He touches it to the quartz nail and he holds it there until the nail is scalding red hot. He removes the torch and the quartz remains red for a brief moment. The resin still stuck on it, burning off into a small white, thin wisp of smoke. He hands me the beaker bong. I take the dab tool and take the entire thing to the face. I didn't cough until I exhaled, and then I coughed until my lungs hurt and I could barely breathe. I didn't know it at the time, but I was headed for an interrogation of the self of cosmic proportions. The final ingredient, though, hadn't yet been added. The peak was still coming. That's when I'd do it. My cousins conveniently passed out right after their dabs, and I continued watching the show. Once I was sure my cousins were fully asleep, I took out the red Lotamax ticket with the gram in it. I still wasn't very experienced and didn't crush the K yet, so I sniffed it. Damn near a third of the thing. A great deal going past my sinus cavities and into my throat. I wasn't very good at letting it sit in at this point of abuse. So there I sat. My cousins had begun watching Black Mirror before they slept. An episode with space visuals, and during a scene with planets and stars in it, something unbelievable happened. The planets, the stars, the entire space scene had left the television set itself. I was looking at the wall, away from the TV now, and I was still staring at a shot of a planet and a bunch of stars. I got up, looked at them from all angles, and I was taken back, as the angle changed consistently with my perspective around them. I orbited this seemingly large planet in a few short steps. I was both larger than a planet, yet stuck in the very same room I was a few moments ago. The universe had shrunk. Of course it had. This planet could fit right on the shelf over there above the TV. How else could this possibly have been explained? Still, despite the clear vision of this, I was completely aware that it was a hallucination. I hadn't completely lost my mind. Not this time. Well, not yet at least. But I was about to head there, as this would soon turn to something else. It began as a feeling of my body falling away, like small grains of sand, into an abyss orientated on a plane or axis that was outside of our own Euclidean three-dimensional world, like I was falling away behind reality itself. I'm not sure where it started to go in this direction. Maybe it was when I began thinking and dwelling on life, but a deep fear began to penetrate my very core. Not a primal fear, not a feeling of eeriness or unsettledness, but an existential realization that I was putting myself onto the path to jail. A gift of an educated child, a rarity of my community, wasted just like the rest on selling drugs. Then I suddenly found myself seeing a timing clock on the TV. I'm not sure why, but I decided to re-watch On My Block, but the episode where the clock ticks down the entire time signalled the time I had left to confess what I was doing, to the very universe that had dissolved my ego and sense of self. I was at its mercy. I was no longer in control. This was now the confessional. The clock ticked down, and I sat there with my thoughts. I would become familiar with this feeling. It was what happened when the police arrested you and left you in the interrogation rooms for a while to build up the tension. The universe itself had now become my cosmic interrogator. Why was I doing all this? Why was I disappointing my mother? Why was I wasting the gifts of education and more for this lifestyle? Well, it was simple. I needed the money, but at the time money wasn't the question, but simply the moral implications. Mostly around how my mother would feel if she found out I was arrested, and how awful it would be inside a prison cell, all because I sold weed and mushrooms, a plant and a fungus. Later I wouldn't be so bothered by this morally, as I would come to develop my personal philosophies, but at this time it was the most profound cosmic event that had ever happened, and it happened all to interrogate me, and get me to tell the truth about everything. I remember after a while, after the episode ended, that I began to come down. Then I remember watching the episode where Caesar kills another kid, and I'm reminded of the possibility that this could be me. I dwell on this thought for a long time. Tears filled my eyes as I realised that I didn't want to do this anymore. I couldn't run from the law for a murder. But above all, I could never outrun myself for having murdered someone. It had actually felt like I'd really killed someone, and the guilt filled me intensely. However, I don't remember much after this, other than I came to terms with it and made peace with it all. I'm sorry, it's just been so long. However, I wasn't done yet. I took out some more of my K and sniffed another great deal of it, sending me right back into the K-hole. I was completely separated from my body this time. That feeling of sand returned, falling away behind the border of existence itself, and off I was again. I fell away into a motion of rotating to the right. This progressed until it was reduced from a rotating movement to simply a process. There was no longer a me, an I, a self to feel this motion. So now, the completely merged environment and subject both experienced this motion at its most basic form. The progression not on physical plane, but through a conceptual process. It was indescribable, this process. All I could ever say about it was that I believed that this was what people meant by God. I was raised with some knowledge of Western Catholicism, but I never took it seriously after a certain age, and instead focused on my traditional religion. The Sundance, or the Okan, as we call it. This must have been what my culture's doctrine was referring to when they meant God. This complete state of cluelessness, acting without thought, without direction. My only goal right now was to experience this. No thoughts or processes of anything was happening anymore at this point, as I had this realization. And suddenly, a moment of pure bliss. There was no other word for it, at least not in English. I had reached a state of becoming connected with the Itse Pati Puoyupa, which translates to the one through whom we live, or the source of all life, and is a concept many may know, as it is in the third line of the Blackfoot prayer, calling the source of life, the one whom we live through. I was stuck in this state for around 30 minutes. The next part I don't really remember arriving at, but I do remember suddenly finding myself there. It was a black void of nothingness, silence, complete absence of existence except the thinking subject. Which meant that although I didn't realise it yet, the semblances of the self, the ego and memory, the three essential components to maintain a thinking subject, had begun washing away. If any of these is fully suppressed, an eradication of the subject can be achieved. Allow me to quickly just elaborate on that thought more. You see, the hallucinogenic experiences, regardless of class, happen by the disruption of this system of three components. These three components all organise and filter information for the process of recall. That is, to remember whatever information you processed. This ability to remember past events is essential to the formation of an ego within a timeline of events, within a linear temporality. If this is disrupted, the self cannot be formed. One finds it hard to place oneself temporally and so on. The entire process happens like this. The external information of the external world is processed by the first component, the ego, which filters useless information and organises it into a compact and digestible form for the second component, the self, to experience this information easily. Once the self has received and experienced this information, it will then be sent to the memory bank, which, if the entire process was uninterrupted, would then result in a memory being saved for recall in later use. To disrupt any part of this process is what leads to the hallucinogenic state, as well as memory loss and amnesia. During the psychedelic experience, the ego is suppressed or temporarily eradicated so that the self is left to experience all the raw, unorganised external information. Unable to distinguish what is useful, it is left to experience it all. External reality in its raw, unfiltered form. That is why you can often remember a great deal of your trip, though not all of it. While memory is left intact, your mind cannot recall all of that unorganised information in detail. It's lost during the recall process. During dissociative use, in lower doses, the ego is minimised as well as the memory suppressed. The self is usually left intact, hence the private theatre feeling of the external world. While higher doses kill the ego and completely suppress memory, as well as the shutting down of sensory organs like the eyes, nerves, ears and so on, leaving the self in an isolated pocket of consciousness with no access to external stimuli, and no ego to organise hallucinatory information, as well as memory suppression, which removes preconceptions of the subject before the whole. During deliriance, the external stimuli is already altered by means outside of this system, while the system, while not usually, will occasionally run just fine. Instead, it processes false information, though most of the time the system is unpredictably interrupted as well. But you see, one important realisation that I could never shake was made here, in this void of black, that no matter how much I had eradicated my preconceptions, as well as my sense of self and ego, I could very well forget who I was, where I was, and so on. But inside the whole, a square still had four sides. The colour red was still red. The concept of presence versus absence was still viable here, and so on. This was always true for every K-hole. So, this means that the subject can never be isolated in a vacuum, which is the main goal of the philosophical process known as methodic doubt, which is set out in Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. Later on, and perhaps most importantly, I would come to use this realisation to reaffirm my beliefs in Hegelian recognition. As Hegel critiques Descartes' methodic doubt, because no subject could ever be formed without having been influenced by other external and real thinking subjects. That is, you cannot be removed from the influences of other real thinking and living individuals. This was essential, as it was pivotal for me to resist all the mysticism and hoopla of the New Age psychedelic enlightenment, which was really just the capitalists of the West slowly changing Western culture so that it's seen as acceptable once again to do these compounds, when they open their storefronts stocking them. With the spiritual systems destroyed by the church and religious prosecution, it was only natural until Western, spiritually underdeveloped wannabe shamans got a hold of other religions' concepts. Grasping for straws in anything and everything, looking for some possible system of spiritualism to latch onto. Forever searching, with their only source being from the capitalists who sell it to them, or to exploit the land and its animals such as toad venom smokers. Almost none of it is organic, meaning almost none of it is truly spiritual, which is why many Westerners have their egos inflated by the psychedelic and ego death experiences. The only exception in my eyes is the 5-MeO DMT and DPT associated religions, which the former is an entirely new religion created by the Westerners in the US in the 90s, the latter adapting Christian sects to DPT. These are entirely organic, because they evolved outside the psychedelic movements and began as a counter-movement to the illegalization of psychedelics. This enlightenment was simply advertising for when it becomes legal again. Only this time it'll be heavily controlled rather than freely distributed without restriction. I mean, what good is all this if you get lost outside of reality and don't pay attention to your body and mind within reality? You cannot say reality never existed, because that non-existence or non-reality you experience can only be contrasted against the reality you come to know. It cannot be isolated in a vacuum, as there can be no absence without the lack of presence. There can't be things outside of reality without an actual real and existing reality for those things to reside outside of. This would all have a name: existential self-realization, the reaffirmation of one's place within the universe. This allows people to see and recognize other individuals for their autonomy, and to minimize their egos in waking life. The next time I remember doing ketamine was when I combined it with DMT. It was a February night. I was in my room and the house was quiet. My mother was out. So I did what I did best, and did some drugs, beginning with a few lines of K and some joints. I was already high as a kite. Then I decided to vape some DMT in my PAX herb vaporizer. So I load some into the chamber with a substrate of weed and turn it on. While waiting for it to heat up to the appropriate chamber temperature, I take a line of ketamine. It drips into my nasal passages and throat, and as I'm wincing in pain, I see the light turn from a blinking purple to a solid green. It was go time. I take it, and I hit it. 3 hits. The entire time my eyes are closed, but I open them for a small while. I see the room distorted more intensely than I've ever seen it. It was unnerving, so I closed my eyes. The blackness of my eyelids fill with phosphenes in simple geometry. Then it grows in intensity to fully defined geometry, but not three-dimensional or all-encompassing. I didn't break through. I don't remember what happened these moments, but I remember the come down well. The trip shifted from the intensity of the peak and trip to the relief that a come down was happening. I was still able to move in the real world the entire time, which was another testament to how I hadn't broken through. I changed the song on my earbuds to the next song in the playlist, The Chronicle Church, Mystery, which was a gospel Christian soul song that was only on YouTube. Every single note penetrated to the core of my soul. It was the purest musical experience ever in my life. Every single guitar, violin, string and drum hit all fell together so harmoniously that it couldn't possibly get more perfect than this. Each and every note, sound and change in tempo or staccato was met with an accompanying light show of fully defined geometric shapes. Geometry of rounded, disorganised and flat colours danced and spun against a black background as they shifted from colour to pink to purple to blue then red and so on. I cannot explain what happened next. But after a short while of enjoying the light show, the trip was over. But something was different. Something had noticeably changed. My vision was not saturated and was now vibrant, defined in colour. The world seemed brighter. Every colour was bolder. I registered every detail on the wall. The colour of my clothes and the wood grain on the floor with clarity, vibrance, and with full uninhibited presence. The depression that had drained me for most of my life was finally alleviated. I could finally feel emotions fully. I wasn't constantly experiencing a hedonism any longer. I no longer found that deep dark void at the centre of the mind and the soul, that drains it of all its faculties and of its very will to live. Instead, what I found was a very vibrant glow, a glow that radiated from the centre of my mind and soul. It was as powerful as the very sun itself. Like the energy of Natosi had entered my mind and spirit and illuminated me from within. I immediately began playing my keyboard, which I was despairing over not being able to play. I had realised then and there that I had to truly dedicate myself to practice before I could use it, and so I began practicing. This was the beginning of me practicing music, though I still have yet to continue learning these consistently. I've had a renewed interest, however, so maybe all I need to do is another line of ketamine with a puff of DMT, and I'll be rocking out. I don't know what else to say about this experience, other than I produced a completely self-composed short EP work, and I still enjoy listening to one of the songs to this day, so I'll move on to the next part of this journey. You see, I don't know why I never realised it. It was right in front of me. The magic. The K-hole. It was becoming more and more elusive. I was dosing every 2 weeks, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't go on the semi-frequent binge. I'll go deep into a gram usually, but then one time I bought an entire 8-ball. This is where things sort of hit the fan. I went through the whole 8-ball in my first multi-day binge. A K-hole that quickly turned to just strong dissociation while still being present in your body. It turned to something I needed every 2 weeks. I really could no longer go without it. Going to school, work, family outings and so on was filled with a constant feeling of a hedonism, but markedly different than that felt in depression. However, that wasn't even the last of it. Then the pandemic happened, and I went even harder. The government COVID support gave me a ridiculous source of money for drugs during those first dreadful and anxiety-inducing months, and when I qualified for the first worker benefit, it stretched even longer. During the first months of the pandemic, it really felt like the world was ending. The external and real world I yearned to return to from my dissociative wonderland was falling apart. To the old, it was just another event in their history, maybe a confirmation of their cracked-out right-wing conspiracy theories, but to others it was a radicalisation of the working-class people, finally forced to see their conditions for what they are. But for a special breed of us, the young 20-something-year-olds who were not in school, not working and not in training, it was the end of the fucking world. For those of us who did drugs, it was the excuse we needed to indulge into our vices to the complete fullest. And so I did. In the second month of the pandemic, I had bought an entire quarter of ketamine, and had done it in less than a week. In only 3 or 4 days, I believe. Oh, that come down. It was dreadful. I remember running out of the ketamine and fully understanding that sobriety in its full force was just over the horizon. This routine was becoming more and more unsurvivable, unaffordable, and more taxing on my mind. If I ran out of the funds to get more, I'd spend the next 2 weeks until the next paycheck in a miserable mess. Feeling the full brunt of reality was unbearable. You cannot understand it until you've lived it. These days are the longest days. Even just sitting there is terrible and makes you feel awful, and is at least extremely boring. However, doing the full responsibilities demanded of a sober person, it was even worse. Eventually, after half a year or so of carrying on with this, I got into dissociative research chemicals. I'd always been seeking these chemicals, and suddenly within a year, I got to try them all. It would send my mental health into a spiral of mania, and the exacerbation of my undiagnosed BPD. While waiting for the first gambit of chemicals to make its landing from the hop over the Atlantic pond, I kept doing my usual ketamine, but then, without any warning or indication, the ketamine dropped in quality. Needle shard ketamine was no longer the norm. It was the first time I saw rock ketamine, and at first I didn't notice it, but it was just 2-FDCK sold as ketamine. It burned a lot, and for some reason this didn't tip me off for a really long time. It had a similar dissociating feeling to ketamine, perhaps just a light version, that I couldn't really tell the difference besides the extreme burn at first. That and the duration, lasting nearly 3 hours. After a while of ruining my nasal cavities with fluoroketamine, I had an epiphany that this ketamine may not in fact be ket at all. So, finding online that fluoroketamine can be smoked, I decided to try to smoke it out of a bong on top of a bed of cannabis. If you know me, if it can be smoked, I'll try to smoke it. If no one knows if it can, then I'll be the one to find out. It hurt my lungs a lot, and I mean a lot, but it worked splendidly. Excited, I invited my friends to come smoke with me. We smoked the fluoroketamine and got severely ripped off it in the middle of a little urban garden beside a busy path and street. I remember after a while getting the other chemicals I ordered and started to experiment with those. But this was a ket report, so I'll keep this part limited. Basically, in chasing the dragon, the K-hole, I'd found myself at the first stepping stone of a long path down dissociative experimentation. After running through them all, I found myself manic, delusional, and mentally ill. I, however, did not find a hole in any of these chemicals except a select few. I was honestly disappointed. I remember being so beat up by this all that I was down to my last chem, a bag of efenadine, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't keep getting high off all these every day. I needed to get back to reality. So I gave my entire 5 grams or so that I had left to my friends while meeting up with them one cold night. I walked home, ready to face the entire brunt of the coming days. And surely it came. I spent a month off the dissociatives, leaving my province to my home province to get away from all my access to drugs. When I came back, I decided to try ketamine again. I've recounted this in another report, but I was overcome with my first experience of the effect of physical autonomy, observing actions I did not identify with at all. These were not my actions. This confirmed to me that the K-hole wasn't gone just yet. The magic was here. I just needed to take a long tolerance break. So after many attempts at multi-week breaks, I began to lose faith, as it never brought the magic back again. Eventually, I would come to reduce my use of ketamine. I'm currently almost on my 2nd month of a planned 7-month break. This came after a kitty flipping experience which helped me deal with the many issues I tried to solve with ketamine for so long. Slowly, I think the magic is coming back, so not all hope is lost. Let's hope, after I return to this, that it doesn't get out of control again. To those of you shaking your heads and asking, why doesn't he just stop? First of all, it's they. Second of all, I'm never going to stop rocking hard, baby. Not till this wonderful chemical has been wrung of all of its magic and wonder. Then maybe I'll stop. Because, I'll have to then. What would be the point anymore? Even then, psychedelics is still a rabbit hole I've never fully explored, so I'll start getting into those. And hey, what would you have done at the end of the world? Could you really say you wouldn't have done what I did? Until the next time exploring the self and the mind, Etazhi.